We're now in a pretty bad situation with infrastructure. We're all suspicious enough now to know it's a certain kind of democracy, which is actually the politicians doing favours for powerful people. When they get into power, they write a cheque of billions of dollars for the developers of infrastructure who have been sensible enough, clever enough, Machiavellian enough, financial enough to put in the contract. The body that is appointed by government, its independence from that government is compromised. So it is possible, as we put more power into bodies like this, it becomes more tempting for governments to appoint their own folks. And so that means that the last stop to defend basic democratic norms is, guess who? The demos, people themselves, but not as voters. Now, I want to privately fund this because it will take until I'm dead to get governments to agree to this stuff. They can't even agree to independent infrastructure assessment. I want to privately fund such a thing like that. Welcome to our second edition of an occasional series. It's occasional so far anyway, and it's called Policy Provocations, short policy ideas and discussions with me and my friend, colleague and partner in podcasting crime, Jean Tunny. And without any further introduction, I'll hand it over to Jean, who has the problem of telling you clearly what we're going to talk about.
Hello, thanks, Nicholas. Yes, I thought it'd be good for us to discuss this issue of regulatory impact statements and cost-benefit analysis studies and how they're used in the policy process. So I thought about this when I read this newspaper article in the Sydney Morning Herald about how Dutton and Albanese unite to block teal transparency demands on $120 billion of projects. And what it was about is Allegra Spender proposed this amendment to, I think it was the Infrastructure Australia Act, whereby if there's a project worth more than $100 million, there has to be a cost-benefit analysis study and a favourable cost-benefit analysis study before it gets on to the Infrastructure Australia priorities list. And I thought, well, that's actually a really good idea. Yep. So why is it that the government and the opposition don't want this? And I mean, obviously it's because they're both sort of conspiring in a way because they recognise that there can be political advantages in putting forward projects. And so they're both reasonably happy with that. And we end up with this really bad equilibrium. So I thought that was a great idea. And then I noticed that you quoted Glenn Withers on Twitter, or you quoted Glenn in a report, a lateral economics report, to the effect that we've had all of these regulation impact statements and they're supposed to try to limit, bad regulation to avoid. So we're costing the impact of regulations on the community and on business. And so we'll only get the best regulations. We'll only get regulations that are welfare enhancing. But the point Glenn was making is that in a lot of cases, these regulations are, there's a tick a box exercise. There's not really that rigorous analysis of the costs and benefits of these regulations. And unfortunately, I mean, this is, that's true. And I think that is the case. And there are all sorts of things that get approved on, public health or safety. Those sort of, if it's something benefits health and safety, then often there's a less rigorous process, or there's no process at all.
Or something that says that it benefits health and safety.
Exactly. And so, the various examples during the pandemic, and also, various measures such as smoke alarms. In Queensland now, we have to connect all the smoke alarms in a house or apartment so that they all go off at the same time. They have to be hardwired to connect.
Why?
And apparently that's best for safety, for health and safety. So, right. I'm not entirely sure. I haven't seen any regulatory impact statement on that. I mean, that's the sort of thing I'd like to see a cost-benefit analysis on, because that's going to cost homeowners and quite a significant amount of money. So there's all those sort of things that happen that there isn't really that rigorous analysis. And so what I wanted to chat with you about is whether this is an example of where we could use your evaluated general concept to get better policy, so that there is a process, or there's somebody responsible for making sure that the necessary analysis is done of policies and programs such that do impose costs.
Yeah. So I think that there's a bunch of things that have raised, and I think the way to talk about them is firstly talk about them kind of on the surface, talk about what can be done in terms of rulemaking and rulemaking from above. And then I think there are a bunch of other issues which almost no one really talks about. But let's start by talking about regulation from above or dealing with this from above. I'm not myself, I'm sorry, I should have probably gone and read up on the terms on which the ALP rejected Allegra Spender's proposal. Of course, the thing that is, shall we say, amusing about it, based on what you've said, is that the leader of the opposition, Kevin Rudd, who became Prime Minister, Kevin Rudd, came to government arguing for Infrastructure Australia to be an independent statutory body that would do cost-benefit analyses of major infrastructure projects. So I think it's obviously a very important thing to be doing. There are interesting questions about whether, having done a cost-benefit analysis, whether politicians themselves should then be free to ignore it and just go ahead with what they reckon is the best thing. That's democracy in a way, but we're all suspicious enough now to know it's a certain kind of democracy, which is actually the politicians doing favours for powerful people rather than having very objective views about what's best for the community. So the more we can, at the very least, make that process transparent, the better. And I would have thought that, I mean, we're now in a pretty bad situation with infrastructure because I'm from Victoria. I think that Victoria might be the not the world's worst practice, but the nation's worst practice as far as having two different infrastructure plans with the two major parties, and then when they get into power, they write a cheque of billions of dollars for the developers of infrastructure who have been sensible enough, clever enough, Machiavellian enough, financial enough to put in the contract, yeah, look, this is really going to be very tough for us to wind back. So rather than just meet any necessary costs, you owe us this many billions of dollars. And they even have some arguments for that because, of course, it is costly to raise finance, and it's costly in terms of one's credibility in the market to then turn it all back on itself and so on. So we've, as government has gone from Labor to Liberal to Labor, billion-dollar cheques get written out. That's an incredibly, we should be really angry about that. And it's in contexts like that, I mean, one of the things that raises is my other go-to solution, which is to say, I don't think the answer is just to let politicians do whatever they want. If politicians want to deviate from these from objective cost-benefit analysis, then maybe we have a randomly selected council of people with some expertise, and if they give the tick to it, fine, it can go ahead, and if not, it can't. This is worth billions of dollars. It's pretty serious stuff. So that's so we need. It's a major thing that we need to have happen, and it's pretty distressing and disturbing that a coalition of our two major parties stand in the way of doing it.
So with that council, were you talking? So we randomly selected? Randomly selected from the population or of people who are have some expertise in infrastructure?
I don't really care. I'd be happy with a randomly selected from the population because what they're going to do is they need a budget and they need to ask experts and get experts from with different perspectives and listen to those. I mean, they're not going to imagine that they can do the analysis themselves any more than parliamentarians imagine they can do the analysis. If they're interested in the analysis. But the public, I think, will be, a body like that would be interested. But, various people think of that idea as that they have a kind of a background hostility to the idea of ordinary people doing this. I don't think there's any problem with it for the reasons I've just said, that ordinary people, when they are confronted with how they make this decision, will actually get experts in and listen to them. But the alternative would be to say that you will have a random panel of people with accounting and engineering qualifications, and you will just put them together and you'll say the 15 of you, 20 of you, 50 of you, and say, unless you can agree that this is a good thing to do, it cannot go ahead without approval of such a group. So that's one way to deal with this. But it's, we haven't even got to first base yet, and first base is for people like Allegra spenders, amendments, what she's proposing to be adopted. The next question is how you get independence, because it's not a trivial matter, and we're seeing this more in the United States than here at the moment. But it's not a trivial matter to say that a body that is appointed by government, its independence from that government is compromised. So it is possible, as we put more power into bodies like this, it becomes more tempting for governments to appoint their own folks. Now, the previous government run by Scott Morrison did this to a deplorable degree with the Australian Administrative Appeals Tribunal, but I think that was as much just getting some cushy jobs for mates as it was a genuine attempt to. It sort of had the possible benefit, as far as he was concerned, of subverting a quasi-judicial process. But the main thing was he was just sort of this was a disgraceful business of looking after mates. In any event, what we see in the United States now is that, so the framers of the US Constitution were more alive to these problems than we are. We handle these things with conventions, which so far have survived reasonably intact. But the Supreme Court now is a political body, and that's pretty devastating for a democracy to be in a state like that. So I think the time to think about these things is now. And in the United States, they are doing things like having redistricting commissions, drawing up the boundaries of electorates with a substantial input of randomly selected people. And the beautiful thing about this, Jean, is that although at the moment, it's not always been the case, but at the moment, Republicans are much greater beneficiaries of gerrymanders than Democrats in the US system. Wasn't always the case, certainly in the South, in past decades. But now Republicans benefit hugely from these gerrymanders that they put in place. But if you ask a Republican voter, then 88% of them think that's a bad thing. 92% of Democrats think it's a bad thing. Well, it doesn't really matter. They're overwhelmingly against it. And so that means that the last stop to defend basic democratic norms is, guess who? The demos, people themselves, but not as voters. It has to, in a different institutional context, they will defend democratic norms much more seriously than politicians will. And I don't want to be moralistic about this. Politicians all the way back to Abraham Lincoln are about building political careers. And that means that they have to make trade-offs between ends and means all the time. So here endeth my homily on the power, on the importance of randomisation and the way in which the people really do support democratic norms if they're asked to do so in the right institutional context.
No, I think it's got a lot of potential. One thing that I wanted to ask you following your conversation, I think it was with Hugh Pope on one of your recent uncomfortable collisions with reality.
Yep.
Who convenes these randomly selected bodies? Who convenes it? I mean, is it the Department of is it the Parliament, or is it? Do you have to have someone do you have to appoint a statutory officer to convene them, to set the agenda? Like, who actually runs that? Do you know how that? Have you thought about how that all works?
So when I was speaking to Hugh Pope, I was speaking to him about the book, The Keys to Democracy, that was written by his father, Maurice Pope, and he was proposing a complete replacement of elections by sortition-based bodies. So he had sortition-based bodies for foreign affairs, sortition-based bodies for domestic affairs and different parts of government and different regions and so on. So it's a whole-scale proposal to completely replace what we have. I'm not hostile to that particularly, but that's not the way I want to do anything, because I'm a deep believer in my own and everybody else's ignorance. And what I want to do is I want to work out where sortition can do the most good, where this process of using lotteries to select people can do the most good, and start the process of having those bodies do those things. Now, your question suggests that an assumption which most people have. They think that we're talking about special purpose bodies, and I'm not talking about a special purpose body. I'm talking about a body that is chosen by lottery that has a similar kind of standing, a similar kind of activity to a House of the Parliament or a House of Congress. So it's there, it's randomly selected, and then it deliberates. And the way I would like to see it is it deliberates as if it is part of the Congress or part of the Parliament. Now, I want to privately fund this because it will take until I'm dead to get governments to agree to this stuff. They can't even agree to independent infrastructure assessment. I want to privately fund such a thing like that, and therefore it can't have any formal power in the Constitution. But I think it would have a lot of power because it, as a participant in political debate representing the considered opinion of ordinary people, it would be very influential. So when Tony Abbott is trying to get the abolition of carbon pricing through the Senate, ordinary people would eyeball this stuff, and they would have worked out that if we pass this, we're going to have to find, by now, $11 to $12 billion more in revenue than we would the other way around, and we won't meet our targets. And we won't have anything to do if the targets, to get to zero. So that's how I see it working. I think it would have, it puts the thumbs on the scale for the considered opinion of the people. Now, so I don't think I don't want any process where the Parliament decides what it's going to talk about, when it's going to run. We've been through all that with Charles I. We had to cut his head off. He wouldn't run Parliament. I don't want to cut anyone's head off, Gene. So it acquires its own status in the Constitution, in the way that the House of Representatives doesn't need the Senate's approval to sit. So that's the way I see where I'm trying to hit.
Yeah, I think the idea of having it start as a private initiative, I quite like that. And you could probably draw on independent experts or people, their expertise, and I think people would voluntarily try to inform that body. Exactly. Because one thing I'm thinking of here in Brisbane is the Cross River Rail. So this is this massive new subway system that we're building in Brisbane. It was originally supposed to cost $5 billion. Everyone expects it's going to cost a lot more than that now. Yep. I think the government's already said there's a $1 billion cost overrun or something like that. It'll probably be even more. Yep. Now, at the time, there were a lot of people sceptical of that, but the government eventually did produce a business case from its infrastructure or Building Queensland body, its independent advisory body, or so-called independent. Yeah. And but I don't know. I mean, there's still a lot of people sceptical of it. I thought that was an example of a project whereby it would be good to have more community input and a debate on it, not just have a government report come down, because this is something that's causing a lot of disruption in the city, in the inner city in Brisbane. Yeah. And potentially it's not really that necessary, given that Brisbane's not a very dense city, and we've already got a suburban rail system. We've got buses, and it's a sort of dubious merit. It was a project that really needed a lot more debate and discussion. And there are a lot of experts, people I'd talked to, people who work in government, engineers who were very sceptical of this project.
Well, I completely agree. We've got our own version of this down in Australia, down in Melbourne. I would imagine it would be worse than yours because it couldn't possibly pass a cost-benefit analysis, the one that the current government is trying to work up a rail loop. And it looks great on a map, and it's easy to tell to the electorate. But if you just pay a bit of attention and listen to people who know about this stuff, it's going to end up costing. Well, it's currently, as my memory tells me, that it's currently costed at $50 billion, but it's more likely to, the general rule of thumb would be to double that. And I don't think that's unrealistic at all. And I think it's likely to carry about 2% of traffic. Because people do not, it looks nice on a map to have a ring road, but it's largely a radial city, and it simply is, it sounds like, and I'm no expert, but it sounds like excruciatingly awful policy, and it's importantly awful policy. Like, I can forgive any government lots of awful policy if it's cheap and it's sort of nodding the head to various people they want to nod the head to. This is likely to be $100 billion, and that's just outrageous. And the other thing I would say is, I think a lot of people imagine that citizen juries will have, if you like, populist instincts about economics. And I think it might actually be hard to convince a citizen jury that tariffs weren't a good idea. But I'm not even sure of that, because people know that they don't know much about this stuff. And so I'm not even sure of that, but I'm a lot more confident that they're going to eyeball this. They're going to eyeball this Brisbane plan or the Melbourne plan, and they're going to say, is this really how we should spend our money? And they won't do it. I mean, the way our system at the moment deals with these issues is largely ideological. So people, if they're on the left, like the idea of public transport, and people on the right want more money into roads. Well, that's just hopeless. I mean, we've got to have the good investment, and we've got to try and work out what that looks like. And it will sometimes be, excuse me, more public transport investment, and sometimes it won't be. And I think the public will be pretty good at working that out, at least as good as our politicians are. And if it doesn't work it out, well, then we can all be happy that was what people wanted. That's the other thing. You end up, the people wanted to do it, and they did it. It's not terrible.
Yeah. Just one thing I'd note is it's not necessarily a left versus right thing here in Queensland, because when Campbell Newman was in power, he changed it to a bus and train tunnel, and there are a lot of concerns about that. I'm not sure that would have. I don't know. It looked like a funny thing to have them both in the same tunnel, and so when Labor got back in, they went back to the Cross River Rail that was a project under the
it's quite like Victoria. It's quite like Victoria Parkette project. I mean, the Dutch manage the coexistence of rail and buses very well, so who knows? Anyway.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a transport expert, but I do think we need more. We just needed more debate and
exactly.
And get alternative views in. And yes,
and wouldn't it be good for a citizen jury or a citizen assembly to say, well, we've had enough debate? Because of course, what happens is that in our partisan system, whoever the current thinking favours says, we've had enough debate, we can't have more reports, and that's a reasonable thing to say most of the time. It doesn't mean it's right, but that's what they'll say while we're getting on with the business and so on. And so just all these kinds of things, we no longer have a system that can make even those kinds of procedural decisions in a way that the community feels is pretty legitimate. One side's going to go, they would have said that. They used the guillotine and they got it through, and next time we'll do that. That's an awful way to solve these problems.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
All right. Well,
okay.
We had a strict regime of doing this in under 20 minutes, and we have failed miserably, Gene. So what I propose is our editor will just speed up the speed of our talk until we fit into 20 minutes. So he probably won't do that. But if we're talking very fast, you'll know why.
Well, now I've discovered it doesn't change the pitch of of our voices. That's fine.
It's good. Okay. All right. Well, we didn't get on to some of the subtler things about putting in place these mechanisms at the top and finding that they don't have much effect down the bottom, which is the regulatory impact statement problem. But we might be able to talk about that at another time.
Okay.
But thanks very much.
Sounds good.
Okay.
Thanks.